Hi, everyone, and welcome back to this month's episode of Logtech Live. I am Eric Johnson. I'm Senior Technology Editor with the Journal of Commerce and JOC.com and host of Logtech Live. For those of you who've caught previous episodes, welcome back. If this is your first episode, really delighted to have you here. Before we get into today's show, I wanted to just mention that we have a brand new sponsor this month, FarEye. So thank you so much to FarEye for supporting Logtech Live. Without you, we wouldn't be able to do this. Also, as always, thanks to the Let's Talk Supply Chain team. Happy to be a part of their growing and exciting network of different content and shows. So I'm joining you from Alexandria, Virginia, Logtech Live HQ. I just got back a day or so ago from Long Beach, California, where I was on site for TPM Tech and TPM 22. Literally a full month, or sorry, not a month, a full week of programming for the containerized shipping industry and global logistics industry. It was fantastic. First of all, amazing to see people in person again. The support for the event was truly took us all by surprise how much interest and excitement there was around it. More importantly, I think we got a lot accomplished. I don't know if we figured out collectively as an industry how to solve all the supply chain bottlenecks that are snarling containerized supply chains these days, but it was therapeutic, especially for shippers and capacity buyers. And it was also a chance to sort of see how professional and rational the industry is. There was not a lot of yelling. There was not a lot of finger pointing. Yes, there's frustration. Yes, there is maybe a bit of resentment, but people have jobs to do and there's cargo to be moved. And that was really evident over the past week. It was really focused on, okay, let's sort of get through this situation, however long it may last, months into 23, and figure out what we do next. So it was just amazing to be on site. And TPM Tech especially was very solution focused. We had something like 20 sessions, 45 speakers, and really focused on kind of where we want the industry to be from a technology perspective, 2 to 5 years from now. It was not so much about the headaches of today, and it's more about what can be done if we start digitizing certain processes. And that's a good lead in for my guest who will be joining us later, Vivian Chang, a COO of BlueX Trade, who I'll just introduce in a few minutes. Um, I do quickly want to mention how much everyone in the industry is concerned about what's going on in Ukraine right now. Obviously, the whole industry is thinking about the people who are caught up in this. It was a big source of discussion at TPM, specifically TPM, figuring out not just the logistics and supply chain impacts, but also just thinking really about how the people are doing and reaching out to teammates and branches that happen to be based in the countries that are affected. So obviously our thoughts are with everyone there. So let's move on to kind of news of the week. There's been so much going on every single week, but I wanted to point out three things that sort of were recent stories that stuck out to me. First is a story that my colleague Michael Angel did on JOC.com about shippers urging the Federal Maritime Commission, the FMC, to sort of build a portal that connects data across all of the gateways that they use. This is something that I've been writing about. There's a big initiative underway from the FMC that I've talked about on this show before, that's trying to figure out what data elements are shippers and forwarders and all stakeholders in the supply chain in supply chains are relying upon, and what's missing and what's inaccurate and what could be improved. And they're going to be coming out with some suggestions on what ports should do. I think middle of this year, June is the target on that. But in the meantime, there's growing discussion about, like, why do we not have a single repository, a single hub that connects all of the gateways? Shippers don't generally just use one gateway, especially if you have any sort of volume. So having a streamlined process in one port but not in the other is helpful, but not ultimately where they want to see things go. So really interesting. I led a panel at TPM about something that the Port of Long Beach is doing called the Supply Chain Information Highway, if I'm not mistaken. They just announced some more details on that yesterday. But that's another way potentially to address this issue, because they've already signed on Oakland and the Northwest Seaport Alliance to involve data that passes through their two ports as well. So we'll see where this all goes, but there's certainly momentum from the shipper side about wanting a cohesive, coherent place where they can get data about where their containers are. It's actually fairly simple when you think about it from that perspective. So moving on to the next story I wanted to highlight. Right before TPM, a company called RPA Labs, which creates sort of bots for logistics providers, did a survey, a blind shopper survey, I should say, where they posed as a shipper, a fictitious shipper, to see how many people would return a quote, how many forwarders would return a quote, and how quickly they would return a quote. And I encourage you to, look up this story. The numbers were not particularly encouraging. This is something that Freightos, another logistics tech provider, has done for a while. Actually, they've been doing it for 3 years, and this just adds more sort of credence to this idea that most forwarders are still either not interested or not set up to turn quotes around really quickly. And I think one of the big topics at TPM Tech, where we had a lot of discussion about technology that's either trying to disintermediate or enable forwarders, a lot of the discussion was around that quoting piece, about how important it is, how important the speed of being able to quote. Obviously, accuracy. You need to have a rate that you can trust as the forwarder and the shipper is actually going to be interested in. But just the ability to quickly turn around a quote request in some cases is the decider for the business. So this particular story is a good prologue for my discussion with Vivian in a few minutes, because it's something that her company is working on as well. So the last story I'll mention is funding for a interesting company that's been kind of on my radar for a year, but was quite quiet about what they were doing. It's a company called greenscreens.ai, building predictive spot pricing tools on the domestic side. So essentially trying to arm freight brokers with the ability to quote accurately and, again, quickly, by having faith in the rate that this engine kind of recommends, that's the appropriate rate at that given moment. So I think we're just seeing a whole bunch of different technologies, whether it's the actual technology that enables the execution of the quote, or information that is supporting the execution of that quote. It's all about speed, right? We're seeing freight kind of follow the same path that we as customers have followed for a long time, which is we want things when we want them. And we don't like a lot of latency or friction in the process. And so anything that kind of contributes to speeding that process up a bit, I think is going to find success over the next few years. So with all that, discussing kind of the state of freight pricing is top of mind right now, especially coming out of TPM and TPM Tech. So I'm really delighted to invite our guest this month, Vivian Chang, COO of BlueX Trade. Vivian, thanks so much for making time today for joining us.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. So you're joining us. It's a little late at night where you are. You're joining us from Taiwan, correct?
That's right. I'm in Taipei, Taiwan.
Okay, cool. Well, we appreciate you burning the midnight oil to share your thoughts with our audience here. Do you want to maybe we can start off with a little background both on yourself and on BlueX Trade? What's sort of the origin story?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Vivian. I'm the COO of BlueX Trade, and we're based in Taipei, Taiwan. I'm actually from Silicon Valley, so I used to live in the Bay Area in California for about 25 years before moving back here. And prior to BlueX, I was an entrepreneur, had started a couple of companies, and I was always on the shipper side. So, in our industry, we say BCO. I was the beneficial cargo owner. And my first startup was actually shipping very large items, baby and toddler car seats and strollers, all the way from Shenzhen to the Port of Oakland. So I knew how hard it was to actually get these huge items across the Pacific Ocean. Back then, you would wait 2.5 weeks. You have to clear customs. Um, the environment then definitely wasn't as volatile as it was now, but it was still a big hassle, right? And we were a very small BCO, so it was sort of like, how do you get competitive rates, and how do you get a booking done when you have goods to be shipped from point A to point B, and usually it's from Asia to the U.S. Or California for the U.S.'s sake. So I come from that background, and did that for years, and really was intrigued by looking at how you can bring e-commerce. So we built car seats and strollers, and we sold them to retail outlets all across the United States, but also obviously through Amazon and through our own e-commerce site. But how do you actually replicate that where it's a D2C consumer business, e-commerce, to a B2B world? And how do you do that within the shipping and the ocean freight industry? And so that was super intriguing. And when I had heard that, you talk about digital quoting and how the survey from RPA Labs showed that, it's still not that commonplace, it kind of boggled my mind. And when I found out that even now, so much of what is being done, is still being done traditionally. And when we say traditional, we mean, loads of paper, phone calls, emails to me is also traditional, right? Like that was a while ago, in the 90s, if you can believe that. And then even the payment process, right, where we hear about people physically going to the counter to pay, it just sort of like blew my mind. And so that's why BlueX was super intriguing to me. And we're really out there to basically try and digitize this whole space. So, and we don't see ourselves playing just in the ocean shipping industry, but over the whole supply chain. So if you are a beneficial cargo owner, somebody who makes goods, how do you help them get from point A to point B, and usually across borders, right? From Asia to the US, or Asia to Europe, or Latin America. It's a global problem to solve. And believe it or not, it hasn't actually been solved entirely yet. I think we can all agree on that. So what BlueX, made it a point to do was, as you know, we started out as building a freight commerce platform. And what I mean by that is basically, how do you build a platform that is very much e-commerce as we know it, but for businesses to businesses. And you picture, when you have to book an airplane ticket, you can go online and do that seamlessly right now. That wasn't possible actually, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. But what we did first was we actually built a solution for Evergreen. That was one of our first partners. And what we did is we digitized 3 things. One was schedules, rates, inventory. So those were the three key things. And we started at the top of the funnel, right? Because Evergreen is a massive carrier, one of the top 10 in the world. And we try and literally come up with a solution on, they have all this data and all disparate pieces of information. And how do we bring that together and offer that as a solution to shippers? And so that was the first part of our strategy from BlueX. And then we actually looked at the bigger problem, and it was really much about like, how do you actually enable shippers to pay, or vendors, carriers like Evergreen, to receive funds? And because, like I said, a lot of it is cross-border, it's not easy. So, if you are a freight forwarder in the United States, you probably are working with a freight forwarder agent of some sort in Asia. So how do you enable payments to handle seamlessly? And like I mentioned before, there are companies that actually go to the counter, at Evergreen and pay with transfer or a cashier's check. And even in the US, there's still a lot of transactions being done via check.
Paper check.
So we recently came out with BlueX Pay. And as you know, and so that is our next step was basically we're building a PayPal for the B2B supply chain platform.
Cool. So I think one of the first things I wanted to address with you is that payment thing, because from the outside, it's a bit of a divergence, but I know from having talked to you for a while that this was all part of the plan, right? So just real briefly, who you had mentioned Evergreen as I believe your first customer, right? Who are your customers, and then who do you kind of connect with who maybe aren't your direct customers, but that you're sort of, because this is a network, right? So can you kind of just explain that for people who may not be familiar with you at all?
Sure. So we actually view as anybody in the supply chain is our customer. We started from Evergreen because, like I said, it was the top of the funnel. They have the inventory, they have the TUs, 10 million a year. And so how do we actually push that out so that shippers, freight forwarders, small and large, can get access to that inventory and the rates and the schedule? But really, we see ourselves as like appealing to both the shippers and the carriers, MVOs, and vendors. And it goes beyond just the ocean carrier industry because there are trucking vendors, right? And there are factories who are selling the goods. All of these players need to transact somehow in terms of payments. So if I'm a shipper in California, with my past business, I would have to pay the factory at some point, or I would have to pay my freight forwarder that has to pay the freight forwarder in Asia. So we see ourselves as having all, any supply chain player. But to answer your question more specifically, for on the white label side, we have partnered with Evergreen, but we also have another product that is for freight forwarders, small and medium and large, that allows them to actually provide, as you had mentioned before, with digital quoting, right? That's actually seems like something that should have been adopted in the industry already, but it's still not happened yet, right? So we actually have a separate product. So any small or medium-sized freight forwarder that wants to actually put their rates up for sale, we have a white label solution for them. And we can customize it. We're super fast. We can do it in a couple of weeks and get them up and running. And a lot of times these small and medium-sized freight forwarders, they might not have a lot of volume, but they do have good customers, and they have customers who they know, who they've been serving sea for years, and they just need to help them get a rapid quote, a quick quote, and get them booked and have a guaranteed container that they know is going to arrive in California at a certain time, or anywhere else for that matter.
Yeah. So I definitely want to get into this piece because this is something that I report on and think about a lot. It's interesting that you said it's kind of crazy that we're still talking about this as a aspirational state for the industry, because had the same sort of thought bonk me on the head at TPM Tech, where we had a panel on kind of digital quoting, and our carriers going to start to require shippers and forwarders to quote, essentially seek out quotes online rather than the traditional methods you mentioned. And I sort of thought back and I thought, geez, this is 2022 and we're still having a session. I could have had this session in 2018 and 2015. And, it is kind of crazy. From your perspective, what has been kind of the constraint on this just becoming a lot more, I don't know, ubiquitous, I guess, for lack of a better term, especially over the last 2 years where you didn't want to go, you wanted things faster. You're doing everything kind of digitally anyway. Why are we not in an environment where virtually all, especially spot freight, is being moved via these types of channels?
So personally, I think the biggest issue is just a systemic one, and it's a behavioral one.
Yep.
So if you picture buying a ticket from, Virginia to Hawaii, you do not expect that you can cancel it. right? Like you book it, and if you want to cancel, it's going to cost you $400, right?
Yep.
Or if you want to change the dates, it's going to cost you $400. I think for a very long time in this industry, in the ocean shipping industry, there was this leeway to be able to cancel containers up until the last minute, right? And so what you saw a lot was double bookings, triple bookings. So, people would go in there and just book, book, book. I mean, I would do the same too. I can't finalize my ticket from Taipei to San Francisco. I'm going to book like 4 different routes if it was for free. And
Right.
so I think that was one core issue that we saw was a problem. And that's why, for example, Maersk Spot is guaranteed. So it's two-way street. You can't cancel as a shipper, but I'm going to guarantee your space as a carrier.
Yep.
You have those 10 containers you booked. So when your goods are ready to leave the factory, it's going to get on the ship. Whereas before, it wasn't very clear, right? It was like, well, it could get rolled over. And hey, you know what? Since you might cancel anyway, it's not guaranteed. But I think what you're seeing now, Mayor Spot is leading the way with that, right? With guaranteed space on their ships, and Evergreen as well, right? When you go to GreenX and you book, you know that you have that space. Um,
That booking through BlueX, whether it's Evergreen and you work with Yang Ming as well, right?
mhm.
Those are guaranteed space, that you're booking a guaranteed space on a
Yeah,
specific sailing, correct?
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
If you're using the Spot platform, that's the handshake, right? Is that you don't cancel either. I mean, of course, there's like as even with United or something, you could change your mind within 24 hours or something
Right.
like that. But you have to commit at a reasonable time before the departure date to say, hey, look, I'm putting down my money and I'm getting on that ship. And then the carrier will do the same. Like I've got your money. I'm going to actually guarantee your space, right? So there's there's a lot of and this isn't rocket science. It's really little tools you can put in there, like, hey, pay within 24 hours or 48 hours to guarantee your spot, right? And literally guarantee your spot. And that's
Yeah.
why it is the spot system. So I think more and more you're going to see that move there. And I think, just to answer your question, I think that's really why traditionally there's been this sort of like, it feels like uncertainty.
I actually wrote the last newsletter. I used to do it. I mean, I still do a newsletter on Fridays. I've took a bit of a hiatus while TPM was ongoing. And the last one I did, I believe, was about um, how our expectations as consumers in the travel industry are totally different as to what you can cancel based on what mode. So if I hotel, you can, there's a little bit of flexibility. Airline, there's zero flexibility. Car rental, there's ultimate flexibility. You can rent a car, you can rent 15 cars and not show up and collect any of them. And there's no penalty at all. Sort of interesting, right? And it felt like we were sort of going through the same type of reckoning in the freight industry now, based on the ability to kind of get certainty through a digital channel. What So let's go into the payment. Well, okay, I do because I that's sort of the interesting news that you all have released in the last month. So can we go back to the payment part, and as I said, sort of from the outside looking in, it seemed not a huge leap, because obviously when you're getting a quote from someone, you obviously have to pay for that. So you need to connect those two actions, right? It's not, you don't want to get a quote and then get taken to another system to have to pay for that, booking. But what made you think initially that it was important for you all to develop that payment tool within the platform itself? And was that always on the roadmap?
Yeah. So it was always on the roadmap, meaning we knew that eventually we would have to, the industry as a whole needs to have some sort of solution, because not only because it's difficult to keep paying in a traditional method, but because it spans across countries, right? That's the fundamental issue we're seeing with global trade is that, and there's FX and there's currency exchanges and there's, customs issues. So, how do we reduce the friction when you need to pay from Hong Kong to US or US to Hong Kong? And we also saw that it was it's frequently a many to many platform. And so what I mean by that is that, you know, when you are booking a plane ticket, it's a one to many. You're Eric, you're going on Expedia and you can see United and Delta and American, right? And in the ocean shipping side, it could be many to many. So it could be, you're seeing a whole bunch of rates and different port pairs from different carriers, Evergreen or Maersk or, OOCL. But you could also see that there's a lot of different freight forwarders that are servicing what you want to use, right? So that adds a whole nother layer of complication. And so the feedback that
It's
we
like
heard a
if
lot.
it's like if I was on Expedia and not only were the airlines there, but also there was 1,000 different travel agents that I could book through in the same.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly. And it's a more complex problem. And that's why you need agents or freight forwarders, right? Because usually you can't, um, unless you have a huge in-house team, if you're a BCO that's very large, you have a whole 500 people to handle your shipping. You can't, as a small business, you would not be able to book from door to door. Right. It's just not possible. Because for us, if we're talking about the travel industry, like I can do it. I could do my rental car from here to the airport. And then I get to San Francisco. I have another rental car. You can kind of put it all together. But if you are a company trying to ship goods from Asia to the US, there's trucks involved, there's customs, there's maybe rail, there's maybe multiple ships. Like if you're shipping from a port in China, you might stop, like it's not a direct flight, right? It's all these, there's three stops. So it's pretty complex, right? And so that's why you have the freight forwarders come in. And so what we found was there were US freight forwarders agents working with Asia agents, and a lot of times they do have to make these transactions in different currencies, and they're not just paying each other. They're paying the vendor or the factory in the China side. They're paying the customs brokerage. They're paying for insurance. They're paying for trucking. So there's so much money exchanged. How great it would be to have this BlueX Pay, this network where if you're a vendor and you're a shipper and you're both on this network, it makes it super easy for you to just move money from your wallet, right? It's just like PayPal. And it happens instantaneously, at a very low cost, versus Swift is $30 and it can take a while. So that's where we're coming from, is like, how do we build out this network which makes it really, really easy for B2B players anywhere on the supply chain to just pay each other.
got it. Yeah, super interesting, and obviously you're not alone in realizing the need, or the lack of tools in this area. There's just tons of activity in various segments, and it feels like there's this sort of momentum that's going to be hard to stop around it. So very cool to hear, and I know there's probably more to come in terms of payment options or tools as well, right? Is there anything like on the roadmap
Yeah.
beyond what you've released?
Yeah. So I think we can all agree, ever since the pandemic, the market is just really volatile, right? And so we've tried to solve it from a couple of different angles. Not solve it, because it's a huge complex problem. It's probably not solvable. But
Mitigate.
one problem we saw, and I think you actually had an episode on this back in November, was on all the demurrage fees, right, that were happening, especially in Long Beach. So shippers, they're getting hit with $300 a day, over a week, on 10 containers. That's $20,000, right? It's not It's not a small sum, and that it's in addition to their shipping that's gone up 10x. So we saw this as an issue, and so we've since come up with a solution. We're still in beta, but it's a pay it later solution. So basically, if you're a shipper and you don't have the cash flow to pay for your shipping now, you can basically ship first, pay later. So what we'll do as BlueX is we'll pay on your behalf, and because we've been in this industry for so long, we have a lot of connections already to all of the 12 carriers. We can actually help you release your cargo faster. So we'll pay on your behalf. Your cargo will get released. You get your product. You can go and make your sales, and then you just pay us back 30 to 60 days later. So we're pretty excited about that because we really do feel like this is a pain point for a lot of small to medium-sized shippers who are incurring these fees, and not just on ocean shipping, right? Trucking, I'm sure you've heard the fees are extremely high. And I mean, everything is just backed up, right? Like we're seeing a lot of congestion.
Having sat with a bunch of different shippers over the past week, especially some on the smaller end of the scale, you're absolutely hit the nail on the head. They're under a whole bunch of pressure on the base rate, but also on the fees that they're getting. And that conversation you referenced was our episode last month, actually. And just the ability to have, it can really tie up cash flow when you struggle to be able to, sort of dispute some of these charges, even if they end up being legitimate. Right, like the ability to pay that much in a short period of time when all of your inventory is essentially potentially tied up in one or two boxes is pretty hard to manage. So very interesting. You hit upon something that I wanted to just dig into a little bit. And this, I think, gets to a question that I was going to ask later, which is sort of dynamic quoting actually achievable? Because this is something we talked about at TPM. We had to do the virtual TPM last year. And this is something that I talked to you about on a panel there. And the reason I wanted to dig into this right now is because you mentioned the word inventory, right? About the ability to digitize a carrier's inventory. How close are we to that, and how important is it for that inventory to be captured digitally? Because I've heard sort of conflicting things over the years that like, no, we're moving toward that, or yes, carriers have no way to really capture digitally what their inventory is in any given moment. Can you clarify that at all?
Yeah, I think it's a definitely a huge problem to solve, and whoever can solve it, it's going to be a massive change in the industry. To start with, I think it's about having good data. So I think you mentioned in your opening remarks the port data, right? It's not always unified or standardized, and that makes it really difficult or accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it starts with having good data. And so, instead of thinking about it as dynamic quoting, we like to think about it as dynamic pricing. And then we actually like to think about it one level above that, which is actually dynamic pricing is the feature. The benefit is actually revenue management. So if you're a carrier, obviously it's very important for you to be able to quote quickly and get the quotes right to the customer so that they can make a booking, so that they can get their goods shipped. But ultimately, what is the price that you're giving them, right? And now the market is so volatile. How do you know, as a carrier or a freight forwarder, NVO, to price it at 10,000 versus 9,000, right? And I mean, and how do you know if you're competitive or not? So BlueX has used a lot of AI and machine learning, and we're just basically taking a lot of historical data. We look at industry trends. We kind of look at what is going on in the marketplace, and we really do try and match up supply and demand. And once you can try and get that sweet spot, you can actually come up with a suggested price for the carrier or the NVO freight forwarder to give to their customer. And if you price it too high, you might not sell. If you price it too low, you might have overbooking, right? In which case you'll have rollovers. So it's actually a very big problem to solve. But if we use technology and AI to get there, I really do feel like there's a lot of opportunity. And there's been so many reports out there. One of them being McKinsey's, that you can really boost your profit by a significant amount just through using dynamic pricing, or revenue management is what we would like to call it. And we think the industry is going there. We've been talking to a lot of carriers, and they know that it's very important because, as you know, I think traditionally a lot of stuff is still being done in Excel, right? Which is not sustainable, because how do you analyze these vast amounts of data? And you can picture, as a carrier, not only do you have data from your internal corporate headquarters, but you have 240 ports all around the world
Right.
that has all this valuable data. And when these containers leave, or how these containers are delayed, and what the sales team is pricing for those containers in this market at this time of the year. It's all such valuable data. And if you try and do it manually or through Excel, it's just not going to work. And it has to, we believe it really has to be centralized at the corporate level, where all these data inputs are coming in, and there's a pricing team who's looking at it and analyzing it, literally like with a click of a button, be able to say like, okay, today I'm going to price it, $500 higher than it was priced last week.
Super interesting. I think the inventory piece of this is probably the least understood about the complexity, right? Because if I go to buy a ticket for on an airplane, yeah, there's a ton of moving parts, and the airlines are constantly figuring out what to price each seat based on when the flight is going to take off, and the demand, overall demand, historical and current kind of factors. But if I get myself to the airport, that's the only variable, right? Like, I just need to figure out how to get myself onto the plane. If I buy a ticket for a concert or a sporting event, same thing, right? It's the event's going to happen. There's a certain number of seats. When demand goes up, or when the number of seats shrink, demand goes up, so I pay more. It's not so simple on a vessel, because you have a slot on a vessel, but you also have to figure out, is there going to be a container available, right? Is there a lot of space on this ship? So ultimately, it doesn't seem like demand is very high, but there is a huge demand to reposition the container that might be used into another port, where I'm going to get more lucrative revenue on its next leg, right? So there's all these factors that, to me, contribute to an inventory management situation from the carriers that still, I don't think it's, and I should say the carriers, as if they're one big company. They're obviously all at different stages of this, right?
Yeah. Oh no, I think it's a super complex problem to solve, but I think it's, for us, we find it super interesting, and it's like a challenge, right?
Super
Because
interesting. Yeah.
it's not solvable by human. I actually don't think it's solvable by humans, even if you hired like 1,000 geniuses, because there's just so much data. And if you think about, these containers on these huge vessels that have multiple stops, and that sometimes these containers go on like smaller vessels, inland vessels that can kind of navigate through different islands. They have to take the containers off, put it on another vessel. I mean, it sort of hurts my mind on how algorithmic and how complicated it is to actually track all of this. But I think it's super interesting, and we have a stellar team of data scientists who are tackling this problem and using machine learning algorithms to actually solve it. And we've been able to actually predict the price to very, very high degree of accuracy, in terms of where we see it moving. We can kind of like test it to know that we were
You can
really close.
iterate fast, right? If
Yeah,
if there's no uptake on it,
exactly.
it can be adjusted, right? It's not a rate sheet that's valid for 30 days and it looks woefully out of date, like
Totally.
the minute the email is sent. So,
Yeah.
um, Maybe one last question, because we are running up on time. I could go on for probably another half hour, but they're going to kick me off here soon. So you started off, which makes perfect sense based on where BlueX Trade is based, and focusing on carriers in Asia, focusing on activity in Asia. Why do you think Asia was a little bit behind on this relative to Europe, where we started to see, both software companies addressing this, but also shipping lines, right? Most of the shipping lines that had this capability earlier on were in Europe.
I actually think that's a really good question, and I do think that, actually in Taiwan, you are seeing it happen. And I do feel like a lot of it might be because we don't have as much transparency into what China is doing. But, we have seen a lot of movement from like OCL and Costco, for example. They actually do have pretty good digital quoting tools. But again, because it's more within the bounds of China, I think maybe we don't see it as easily, right?
That's
Because
right.
yeah,
I'm
um,
not I'm not seeing that same intra activity as I would, TP or Asia Europe, right? So that's fair.
yeah, exactly. And so, and we have seen some bigger digital freight forwarders who are completely, based in China that is targeting the China market, but doing huge volumes. But you wouldn't normally see that if, I hadn't seen it in Silicon Valley until I came to Taiwan and was in the industry. So I think there is quite a bit of movement. But I do think that, traditionally it could also just be because in Asia, people were, they were more used to having this high touch customer service where, here it's even now like people will just pick up the phone and say like, I could easily go book my plane ticket on Eva, but actually I have an agent I could call, believe it or not, and they're happy to talk to me, or I can like
Yeah,
text them and they're like, hey, how can I help you? And it's a different sort of maybe a cultural thing where people are very into like this kind of relationship based system. So, in terms of digitizing, once you bring on a digital quoting platform, I think, the Silicon Valley part of me is like, oh, it's great because we should use technology to solve a problem. But on the other hand, it also starts to create this barrier, right? Where before you could call up your sales guy if you were, in China and you're like, oh, I gotta like ship some strollers out. Can you just hook me
yeah.
up? Like production
You,
finish more quickly. I just
you
need to
think
get
you
five.
think you're going to get a better rate because you have that relationship than you would if
Exactly,
you
right? But then
pulled
now it's like,
pulled hard data from the online system, right? So
yeah. And now the sales guy might be like, hey, I'm sorry, you got to go to the platform. I could give you a quote, but you probably get a better rate there. And so then you feel kind of like, oh, well, but I know you, man. Just get me
yeah,
on the ship, right?
yeah.
So I think there is a trade off too. So
That's super interesting, and I hadn't heard that before. So that's something to take into account in all this. Well, Vivian, thank you so much. This has been fantastic for me, and hope everyone else found it as useful as possible. This is an ongoing evolution where there is sort of no finish line, I think, on this, because there's just so much to do, and but so many interesting companies doing it. So thanks so much for joining us, especially at this late hour. I really appreciate it, and we'll talk soon.
you're so welcome. Thank you, Eric. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Okay, so real quick, our two standard gimmicks at the end of each show, not gimmicks, parts of the end of each show. Dad joke of the month. You guys ready? Get the banner up. What do you call a bedside table that strays? Are you ready for this? A one night stand. Get it? Yeah, sorry, it's a little risque on this month's episode. So let's finish off with our buzzword of the month, which is platform. Are we talking about? So I was thinking about platform a lot over the last week because it gets mentioned as a word that's sort of used very easily, probably applied to too many situations. Every company wants to be a platform, even if they're just a software company, even if they make products or solutions, they want to be a platform. So I think we need to think about what a platform actually is. Is a platform a product that is used by one person or one company and or provided by one company and used by another? I wouldn't say that's a platform. I think a platform is some sort of entity, some sort of digital entity that connects multiple parties, and it doesn't even have to be customers, doesn't even have to be paying customers. It's something that sort of enables a network to happen, I guess is probably the way I would describe it the best. So just as you're going through your buying process, your research process, think really critically about when someone says what they're doing is a platform versus whether it's just a solution or a product, because there is a difference, and it's important to know. That was just scratching the surface on kind of this idea. So maybe next time I'll go into it a little bit more. But I wanted to thank Vivian again for joining us today. Thank you all for being here. The show obviously does not happen if you don't show up. So really appreciate your comments and attention today. And obviously, thank you again to our show sponsor, FarEye, for making this all possible. Thanks to this Let's Talk Supply Chain team, and I will see you next month, first Friday of next month. Have a great March, everyone.